maybe Mr. Kiragu, you can tell us that, as also you explain what is Africa Renaissance.
Yes.
And where does all this come when we are talking about affordability in construction?
Yes. When you're talking about the kind of materials we want to use in terms of sustainable construction, you're looking at what we have done, stabilized soil blocks or rammed earth or roofing tiles, FCR roofing tiles, and so on. These are materials that you use where they're built, they're actually constructed, they're manufactured on site by the people who are going to use them, particularly in rural, on peri-urban projects. So the elements that one uses, there are other elements such as we hear, hempcrete and grasscrete and things like that. But the ones that we use here they tend to cut the cost of construction down by anything between 30 and 50%. And the other thing about them is the fact that they're easy to use and it's easy for people to learn. And therefore, these are the sort of elements or the kind of paradigm that you can use to generate employment. As we know, we have serious under and unemployment in our country. So it's always a wonderful thing to be able to have people build their own institutions, whether they're building their own schools or whether they're building their own hospitals or houses and so on, and they're the ones who are using them. So therefore, they build their own little economy around those constructions. Now, Sylvia asked me about what African Renaissance is. It is an issue of, it's a movement that tries to bring back, to restore African civilization and culture into the current context, into the way things are done, into contemporary activities today. Because there is such a thing as an African civilization, and the way Africans did approached their way of doing things, and therefore there is need to bring it back, because without it we have no identity, and without an identity you have no self-determination, and without self-determination you cannot have real aspirations. You have to borrow them, and when you borrow aspirations, it means you're really borrowing aspirations is more like somebody else thinking for you. So you lose all that, and that's what African Renaissance is. It is currently spearheaded by Thabo Mbeki, the former president of South Africa. Yes.
Thank you so much for that. I think we can't understate the fact that the construction type and building type and choice of material and technology can affect the cost of construction. We have our conventional systems, which is the block, the stone with mortar, plaster, but we can look at also other various ways, like what you have used in Nyumbani, which is really beautiful, the soil blocks, and we know that they do cut costs without a doubt. Then, of course, the other issues that will come up is how acceptable are some of those systems to Kenyans. As much as we know they are cheaper, will they be readily, to adopt? Will they be ready to adopt those new technologies? But we can come back to that. Thank you so much. Over to Architect Matole. A wonderful conversation I like to have now that he's talking about renaissance of Africa and getting back what was ours. Sometimes when the CS Hinga came one time to our presentation at the Senate, he had slides that had these constructions that are so built up. And the question we asked him is that how are people supposed to live in these environments? So the question of climate and health comes into question. Maybe you can speak on that and also edge it towards affordability and housing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moderator. And this is an issue that is now coming up, whereby we are having so many affordable housing units being put together in dense neighborhoods. And that is the question that Sylvia here is worried about. I mean, what are the issues around health in some of these developments? And as we know, the topic here that we're discussing is about climate and health in buildings. And in this age of climate change, we have two major problems that are caused by climate change. That is temperature rise and also incidences of flooding, high precipitation that we experienced just the other day. And these also have an impact in our neighborhoods, how we have built and how we can cope. So one of the issues that I would want to address is what Sylvia has asked, the urban heat island effect. If you have many buildings put together, that means you have basically a concrete jungle, and that affects the microclimate. So your temperature within that microclimate is very high, and with our incidences of too much precipitation, then you can get some organisms that grow there. Some of them could be causing diseases. And also when you have too many of these buildings together, you also have issues of dispersal processes that are used to ventilate these buildings, because buildings must be ventilated. Buildings must be ventilated because we have an issue of indoor air quality, and some of these diseases are generated by way of misplacing these buildings in terms of putting them where they're not supposed to be put. That is a planning issue. You don't put housing settlements near dam sites or near industries. And some of these issues are indoor related, like volatile organic compounds from materials that are used to put up the building, like paints, sealants, and all that. So ventilation for indoor air quality is very good, and it not only alleviates the problem of indoor air quality, but also when you look at now housing schemes, this ventilation has to occur at a neighborhood level. So even those guys who are doing all these massive estates for affordable housing, they have to think about dispersal processes. How will we ventilate whole neighborhoods so as we can be able to drive away some of these disease-causing organisms? And also another issue on climate-related effects on buildings is flooding. We have to be able to protect our buildings from flooding. We have to raise essential services like electrical connections so that we don't flood those gas lines, and also resilient materials that can be cleaned up and restored in case we have an incident of flooding. We have to control moisture coming to our buildings using our verandas, roof overhangs, and many other basic technologies. They don't cost money. Like doing a roof overhang doesn't cost money, or doing a veranda, we do them all the time. Some of these things can help us in controlling wind-driven rain, or putting weather strips around our doors. Those are things that are traditional. They've been used for centuries, and we can be able to get them at a cheaper price in the market.
Thank you, Architect. Health of buildings. I mean, those of us in the build industry, you all know that buildings affect psychology. So the question of the concrete jungles that we are busy creating, or houses that never see sunlight, or houses that don't ventilate, or compounds that don't drain, we can see there are really huge issues around that. And when we are talking about affordable housing, I think because of the cost of land, you find that we really pack our site plans with a lot of units, and we are creating these environments that are now questionable. So keep your questions in place, because I'm sure you will want to ask a little bit more, because these are the experts right here. So John, I'm coming to you, John, Mr. John, on the issue of sustainable and effective systems of services to buildings. Maybe you can just highlight the nature of services that we are talking about to buildings, and how, the sustainable and effective approach for affordable housing.
Thank you, Senator Sylvia. Maybe let me just first go back by clarifying some of the titles which you overheard being introduced on. I am a lead green associate. That stands for lead, that is leadership in energy and environmental design. Basically, that's a professional who can be able to steer development towards sustainability in order to achieve green building certification. And then about the INTERNACHI, that's the International Association of Certified Home Inspectors, basically, which is the school which helps people to undergo professional courses in property inspection. So basically, that's what qualifies me as a building surveyor, a professional who apparently enters into a built environment, inspects it, understands the condition, and then reports back on that condition and how that condition apparently affects somebody's interest in that particular property. Whether you are picking interest as a tenant, picking interest as a buyer or picking interest as a seller, how does the property condition affect you? And also, I am a sustainability consultant, that is the late Green Associate. Now, to get back onto the question about sustainable services, basically this leads me back to a very important issue which hasn't been part of our housing delivery system, and that is the services which support the buildings that we build. Now, what kind of infrastructure are we looking at? And this is where I throw in this radical thinking. The radical thinking which says that green building is all about resource efficiency and resource regeneration. How do we have the right services? Services that help us to save on the resources, and services which also, on the flip side, help us to generate resources. Those are the kind of services that we want to see in affordable housing, because inherently, that's where affordability will be achieved. For instance, what are these infrastructure services that we're talking about? We're talking about the energy systems, we're talking about the water systems, and we're talking about the material systems. Materials like the waste that we have in our houses. Traditionally, we understand that when we have material or waste, it's meant to be ejected away from our properties. But aren't we forgetting that when it came into our built environment, it was material, it was valuable, but now we are discarding it as waste. Yet, we can come up with the right infrastructure, the right services whereby we can be able to manage it in a way that it becomes a resource to us, a resource from which we can even be able to generate money. So instead of paying to have it off our properties or our development, we are actually making money from it, money which can also help us to run the other services. We're talking about energy systems, we're talking about renewable energy that we use in our buildings. When we talk about affordable housing, most of the time we will look into issues of densification, and I'd like to say careful densification. We have to be very careful with the densification. We don't want to go the way of over densification and then we end up with unresilient properties like the projects which you've heard about in the US. People are running away from them, but that was densification, but it was not carefully thought out densification. So we also have to be very careful with that densification. And densification, of course, comes with the provision of services, like lighting in common areas, like landscaping for green places. So are we making sure that, let's say we have water coming into our buildings, are we being efficient with it? And then the one that we use, are we recycling it so that we can regenerate that wastewater to become a resource that we can use in the common area, and then we minimize the use of potable water, so that essentially will reduce the service charge. And once you reduce the service charge, it becomes affordable to live in that particular area, and people enjoy living in such kind of spaces, and they don't want to move. In other words, they can be able to age in place and build more resilient communities. But now what you notice is that people move into neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are run down. When the neighborhoods are run down, they want to move away. So in other words, there is never a sense of place, never a sense of ownership. So when we build these houses, we have to make sure that we have services, the right kind of services in place, which can make people enjoy. Affordability can make people enjoy the places where they live. It can make people also live and own those places. They can be able to even take care of them much more. So services are very essential, and we can get them sustainably. For example, I've talked about recycling systems. We've talked about energy systems, solar photovoltaics, because we can also use the common areas, for example, like the parking lots. Let's say we have some careful densification and we release some land to be parking lots. So those parking lots can be canopy covered with solar PVs. Now, with the canopy cover of solar PVs, what can happen is that energy will be generated. That energy will be used to run services. And the excess that cannot be used around can be sold back to the grid. we now have an Energy Act of 2018, which caters for the feed-in tariff. So which means if you generate more energy than you use, you can feed it back to the grid, and now there is a price. Previously, there was no price, so you didn't know how much shillings you're going to get for a kilowatt hour for the energy that you generate and you feed back into the tariff. But that's now in place courtesy of the Energy Act of 2018. So these are the kind of services that we are looking for the future affordable houses to have, because they will drill in that sustainability that we want. They will make people appreciate the houses, and also in a way they will teach people exactly how to embrace and appreciate the kind of houses that they want. In other words, they become centers of excellence as far as affordability and building is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was quite insightful. My next question will be on green design and energy efficient building systems. And I'll ask this to both of you, Architect Matole and John, because you're both green experts. And let's look at cracking the green code. So we start with Matole. Give us some green design and energy efficient building systems that we can talk about in affordable housing.
Thank you, Senator. And when we talk about green design is actually all-encompassing, because green design is all about resource efficiency. And we know we have so many resources that we use in building. So we have material resources. We have to be able to be efficient on these resources. We do not only want to recycle, we also want to reuse, we want to recover. So we must be efficient in the way we use materials. Even during the construction process, there is a construction management process that is recommended by the Green Building Councils that ensures that we recycle most of the material that otherwise would have gone to the dump site. So we always want to minimize on waste. Other resources that are there also in green design include water, and John here has talked about grey water systems, water conservation measures, and of course, energy is one of the biggest resources, and that's why we have this energy efficiency in buildings. And in this case, when we do talk about energy efficiency in buildings, we have to start from the building envelope itself, and as we come down to the components that are used in the building to power our buildings. So when we talk about the building envelope itself, one of the ways that we make it energy efficient, for instance, is to avoid direct solar radiation, because solar radiation will heat up the building. So orientation, it does not cost money to properly orient your buildings, either north-south in this climate, or south when you're in the northern hemisphere, or north when you're in the southern hemisphere. So orientation is a very easy way of being energy efficient, because you just avoid direct solar radiation. And then also we have things like insulating your roofs, because the roof is mostly exposed and you lose a lot of energy, whether you are heating or you are cooling. Your roof needs to be insulated for you to be able to be, first of all, energy efficient. Another area, of course, is glazing. Glazing brings in a lot of solar radiation, and also when it comes to cooling, that's where we lose all our heat. So we have to, for our case in the tropics, we have to shade our windows. We have overhangs, we have balconies, we have verandas, and those are technologies that have been here for centuries. They will not cost extra money just to do a balcony over your window. And when we go inside the buildings, then we have to look at energy efficient light fittings. Nowadays, LED lights are everywhere. We know that they used to be expensive, but now they are very cheap because they are everywhere. So we use energy efficient lighting. We use systems that can detect movement, so that when there is no one in that particular room, you don't have to have your lights on. You have daylight controls. You can use natural lighting instead of electrical lighting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's wonderful. In fact, when these things are mentioned, we remember as architects, we learned these things in school. And a lot of us don't actually utilize them, because when you look around, even just Nairobi, you'll see buildings with the windows facing east, and then you're wondering, what are we trying to achieve? Maybe let's talk about cracking the green code for affordable housing. John, maybe you can pick that up.
When I look at it, one of the first things that comes to my mind are materials. Materials. What are these materials that can help us deliver affordable housing and at the same time break the building code? Basically, we want to ensure that we use the appropriate material for the appropriate climate at all times, because once you don't get your materials right in the first place, you number one, you won't get affordability, that is during the construction stage, as well as affordability during the life cycle, the entire use life of a building, because materials matter a lot. Materials tomorrow are the ones which can help you also integrate certain other green aspects. For instance, we do talk about water harvesting as a green strategy. And one of the green strategies, of course, is that you should harvest rainwater as much as you can. But you're not going to be able to achieve that and get water resilience if you're using a hazardous material. Traditionally, if you look at the materials which were used way back and which even appear in our building code of 1968, we used to use asbestos roof covering materials. But you cannot rainwater harvest on an asbestos roof covering material. It will make you sick. So in other words, when I tell people go and harvest rainwater, I have to be careful whom I'm talking to. I'm not going to talk to somebody who lives in a house which currently has a asbestos roof covering material. We can talk about a different material, but then when you have such kind of materials which are hazardous, it's very difficult and it's very complicated. Let's talk about some of the materials which have a poor thermal capability. They will force you to use energy to cool your house. Probably the thermal mass is not appropriate enough for that particular climate, so you will end up doing the wrong thing. So in other words, when we get the right kind of materials, these right kind of materials are the ones which are supposed to appear in the building code so that we can be able to overcome that. Let's also look at roof covering materials once again. We have to go for materials which also help to reduce the heat, the heat intake. In other words, they are reflective. They don't absorb heat because we're also trying to keep the heat away. Maybe natural ventilation hasn't been well planned for in a building. So how do we overcome that? We can only overcome that with proper materials which you use for our roof covering. So materials are very key. We also need to use the same materials which will also not get us unhealthy. For example, low VOC, that's volatile organic compound materials, and zero lead paints. Traditionally, we've used paints heavily leaded with lead, and that is something which has to be do away with. Locally in the market, there are low VOC paints. They're readily available. There are several companies that have them. So these are the kind of materials which we have to specify and which have to appear in a building code so that we can be able to have a green code. And then at the same time, we also need to look at other aspects which have to do with the surroundings of the buildings. For example, like how do we manage our landscapes? Are we using or are we planting natural or native vegetation that doesn't use a lot of water, so which means we get to save also on water efficiency. So we practice what landscape architects call xeriscaping, things like that. So material, to me, is one of the key factors when it comes to breaking the building code. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kiragu, I'll come back to you on the building systems. Because when you look at the mass housing, affordable housing scheme that is being proposed by government, you can see it has to be high-rise. It has to rise maybe beyond 10 floors for it to make economic sense given the cost of land these days. And I'm wondering about the construction systems that then we can say can lead to, affordable construction type. Maybe you can speak a little on that, and maybe if there's relearning that we have to do to adopt those new construction systems. What is your view on that issue?
Well, personally, what I had looked into what they were doing, and it seemed to have been a modular kind of building precast. And it works for that, and you can go pretty high, as far as high as you wish. And much of it is in situ, it's done on site. However, really, the construction itself, I don't really think it's a question. The question should be, if you have sustainable construction, the contents of that construction are people. Are those people going to be sustainable? That's the point, because at the end of the day, you're building for people. So you want to know, how will society turn out when they live in a certain kind of environment? Is there the backup issues of culture that guide the survival of society within that kind of setup? I thought that is really the question that we should ask. But what I see happening there is there were issues that we raised. We do attend sessions there, and there were issues we raised and said and talked about things like maintenance, because when you have more than 5 stories by law, you need lifts and so on. And you need also to change light bulbs in the staircases, in the distribution corridors, in the circulation system, and lifts, for instance, in a low-cost circumstances like those, are going to break down, and people can't move up and down. Lights are going to go out, and the kind of problems you have on the street, like mugging, will come into the corridors. You understand? Because somebody's coming from work late and so on. There's no light in the corridors, so there are a lot of unemployed people, and that's another issue. In doing our housing, are we creating sustainable employment to lower issues like crime and delinquency and so on and so forth? So that is what I'm talking about now. The sustainability level moves beyond technical into social. Those are the questions that you ask, whether it's going to work or not. And the last I knew was they actually formed a kind of a maintenance levy to make sure that the issues that you had raised in terms of elevators and in terms of public lighting, so to speak, are followed up. But those you people in the Senate, you're in a good position to raise such issues, because the failure to attend to such issues in the co-ops in the US are, for instance, what caused the failure of those co-ops, like the Pruitigo in St. Louis. I think you know about it. Eventually they demolished it. So we don't want this to go that way. So then it's something that we need to look at. On the other hand, it seems that we concentrate a lot on urban issues. There is peri-urban and there is rural. So the people in the rural areas and the people in the peri-urban areas also need sustainable construction, and they also need affordable housing. They are all ours. So when we look at it there, then there's a different paradigm altogether over there. And there are other ways of ensuring. The last, I think Mr. Acholi there talked about empowering people to own housing, not whittling housing down to, trying to whittle down the cost of housing down to zero, literally. But you can also empower people to do that. So that is something we're also trying to do. We are trying to say, this is a piece of land, it's a small piece of land, it's 1/8 of an acre. What can you do on this piece of land and live on it at the same time to enable you to pay your mortgage and for you to have something left over for the domestic use? And that's something that can be done. We've done models. We've seen that this particular model can, say, leave you with 50,000 shillings and your mortgage has been paid. So it's something that needs to be tested, and it's something that we're trying.